Hello, I'm going to be focusing on the Kim reading for my Religion and Ethnicity II post-class assignment, specifically dissecting the idea of plausibility structures and how the Korean American Protestant churches are those plausibility structures for the minority group. So, first, I'm going to get into some background information to better frame the plausibility structures idea that I'll be focusing on. So it's first most important to understand the three waves of Korean immigration into the United States to understand why Korean Americans are highly religiously engaged in the US. So the first wave was from 1903 to 1950. Most of the Koreans who migrated into the US were already Christians, and the pastors were bringing Koreans into Hawaii because they needed a workforce, but then those people migrated to the mainland US. The Koreans who were already Christian were migrating into the States, and the churches provided social services and were a home away from home for this minority in America. A representation of the Korean community for the rest of the United States, and it was a way to engage with Koreans for Americans, especially American leaders. The Korean churches were a way for mayors or other people in leadership positions to engage with that community. So the second wave was from 1952 to 1964, after the Korean American War. So it was mostly women who were married to Americans during the war who came to the US during this time. Another group of people in this wave were orphans of the war who were adopted by American families, and another group were students who came to be trained as missionaries. Little is known about this wave, but it's still very significant. And the last wave is from 1965 to today. This is a result of less strict immigration laws. There are not a lot of people coming into the US for economic reasons from Korea, especially because of the success of the Korean economy recently. But today, Korean churches are still dominated by the first generation of these waves. So most Koreans are Presbyterian or Christian, and on any given Sunday, 80% of Koreans are in a church on a Sunday morning. So these different migrations have different engagement with religion in terms of generational change and periodical change. The generational changes are associated with differences of religious aesthetics, whereas the periodical change is associated with wars and how societies change over time. It's important to note that we cannot talk about Korean churches without placing the different waves because each wave will have a different practice of religiosity. So, in order to understand the question, why do most Koreans in the US attend church? We have to understand the idea of selective migrants. So, these people coming to the US were already Christians before their arrival. So, that was a select group of people who will continue to practice their faith. They go to church because they were already going to church in Korea, even if they were a minority in Korea. Whereas, out of the Koreans in the US, a majority are Christian. Another important factor is that these people are urban middle class because if you are able to make the move to the United States, then you have some level of economic prosperity. Usually, the person who migrates is a person of middle class because you need money and connections to migrate. Also, historically, as we've seen throughout the rest of the course, this type of church attendance is a consequence of being a middle class person. Lastly, the Korean pastors were a big factor into why most Koreans attend US, or most Koreans in the US attend church, because these Korean pastors took on the role similar to the black church pastors when talking about slavery. Obviously, they're not equatable, but the role that a pastor would take on as a political figure, as a teacher, and as a religious leader as well, as just a leader in the community, a social leader, these pastors took in migrants into an already new space. So now it's important to understand this idea of plausibility structures. So we may have an idea of what it means to be Korean American, but in order for those ideas to become reality, we need structures that allow them to manifest themselves, and the church provides that structure. So if we do not have an idea, if we have an idea that women are equal to men, for example, our society should have structures that would allow that, like equal pay. But our society does not have those structures, so we're lacking in those plausibility structures, which is just an example to help understand this phenomena. But in specific reference to the Korean churches, the church provides the structure to be Korean. The church allows these people to maintain one's Korean identity, and without the structure of the church, there would be no plausibility structure that makes plausible the idea of being a Korean in the United States. Because the Korean American religiosity is a network of organizations, communities, and spaces of worship, these people are able to express their religiosity but also have a social foundation, a political foundation in order to practice activism, and they provide a lot of really essential services like financial aid, practical assistance, language, business opportunities, social networks, and status appreciation. Thanks for listening.